Lesson 2. Systems Thinking in Action. In this lesson, we will talk about what is systems thinking. How do we become a systems thinker? We also discuss the laws of systems thinking by Peter Senge, and what are the learning disabilities of organizations, why it is difficult to embrace systems thinking. Systems thinking is considered to be one of the most important qualities of leaders and decision makers. But what is systems thinking? Systems thinking has its roots in what we call system dynamics back in the 1960s. It started with the idea of developing what we call a holistic view of things. Just to recall, we have defined that a system is a set of related components that work together in a particular environment to perform whatever functions are required so that it can achieve its objectives. One of the more prominent systems thinker before is Donella Meadows, and she is known to be a journalist that practices systems thinking. So what is systems thinking? Let's begin by considering systems thinking as a perspective. It is a language that we use to describe what we call systemic behavior. In Lesson 1, we talked about understanding that systems exhibit behaviors, and our goal is to understand behaviors. Systems thinking is also a way of seeing and talking about the reality that will help us better understand and how to work with systems so that we can influence the outcome of our systems. It's also about expanding our awareness to see the relationships more than the parts and be able to see the whole instead of taking them by pieces. Systems thinking is also considered an approach. It is a way by which we try to understand problems by viewing problems as parts of an overall system rather than reacting to specific parts or outcomes or events, and potentially solving problems based on these events, which oftentimes leads to what we call unintended consequences. It is also the process of understanding how things as a whole work rather than what events happened and why. For other people, systems thinking means it is a stepping back of looking at things. We like to look at the big picture, take a wider perspective, consider multiple perspectives. We can also look at it as peeling the layers of an onion by trying to understand what's inside that system. We wanted to examine how things relate to each other and looking for the root causes, which is oftentimes systemic or inside the structure. And finally, challenge and change our view of systems. When we compare systems thinking with traditional thinking always looks at things in a linear manner, while systems thinking considers the interaction of parts leading to a more complex relationship and oftentimes circular in nature. In a typical traditional way of thinking, we normally think of events. And when we look at events, we look at them as linear. For this action, there are consequences, and actions are triggered by information. And once we address the root cause or the information, then the consequence becomes gone. This is a very simplistic way of looking at how things happen. On the other hand, when we talk about systems thinking, we consider what we call a dynamic behavior of our systems, where any information oftentimes experience a delay before we act, and our actions experience delay when consequences happen, and consequences encounter a delay for which new information is generated. This cycle of dynamic behavior, or going around in a circle, is a common behavior or perspective that we bring in systems thinking. When we now try to understand systems, we now apply what we call an iceberg view, where oftentimes we react or see events, and events are oftentimes triggered or triggers decisions that we make. Going deeper into the event is what we call the patterns that creates or links together the events. And what you're trying to understand will be the series of events or the patterns that you see. And that what's causing the pattern is what we call the structure. And the structure is the one influencing the patterns. This is quite similar to what Peter Senge was mentioning about being prisoners of the system, where we try to fix the events, but we fail to understand how the system is structured in the first place. By practicing what we call systems thinking, we are now shifting from an event thinking perspective into a more looping type perspective. We believe that by understanding the system, you get to understand what would be what we call the leverage point, the one that can change the loop, and how the loop can eventually lead back or cause to some other possible consequences. In systems thinking, we see the possibility that root causes can eventually become a cause of the consequence, and the consequence can create other causes, thereby creating other feedback loops that we need to understand. To illustrate our causality as a feedback, we look at an example of understanding profitability as being driven by quality, leadership, and alignment. In the left side, we looked at them as purely a linear way of explaining profitability. From a systems thinking perspective, profitability is not a one-way street, but rather a feedback loop where profitability can influence competition, and competition affects profitability. Profitability also influences leadership, and leadership again brings back its influence to profitability. By looking at a closed loop view, we now understand how influences actually drive behaviors rather than simply looking at them as a mere cause and effect relationship. So how do we now become systems thinkers? We need to now understand the right skills, habits that we need to have and develop in ourselves to be able to constantly remind ourselves to take a step back and understand the whole. Based on Peter Senge's book on the fifth discipline, he talked about the art of seeing the forest and the trees. He also mentioned that the fifth discipline is what he calls a systems perspective, which is the first competency for any leader or organization to learn and grow. It is the ability to see the complete end-to-end of your value creation rather than seeing pieces of your organization or of your system. It is the ability to see your role or the role of pieces to the bigger picture. one important thought to keep in mind that a systems thinker should always avoid jumping to conclusions. A systems thinker will always rigorously examine the assumptions in order to gain insights into a system. We ask ourselves, is this the right conclusion? What assumptions are we making? Why are we making those assumptions? Why do we think that it's the right thing to do? Are the facts facts? Or why do I believe these things? By following what we call the ladder of inference. The ladder of inference is the logic we often apply when we start from our observation, moving back to our actions. And oftentimes, our actions feed back to our observations. The danger here is that if we are not aware, our actions are reinforcing our observations, and therefore we create what we call reinforcing our beliefs. And by doing that, we are now practicing a more limited view of the system rather than practicing a wider view of the system. In order to develop our systems thinking habits, we as organizations or individuals should possess the following habits whenever we try to understand the relationships of the parts to the whole. We try to seek understanding of the bigger picture. We try to recognize how the system generates the behavior. We change our perspectives to increase our understanding. We ask and challenge our assumptions. We use our understanding of the actions and how the system reacts on how to find actions that will influence the system rather than control the system. It pays attention to see all of the changes that happen so that we know that by doing these actions, we are creating the right behavior. In order to develop our systems thinking perspective, not only do we have the right habits, but also develop our skills. These skills emphasize the importance of how we would apply and practice our perspective. Number one, we need to have a dynamic perspective or thinking approach, that things are never static. We need to understand that system is often the cause and not something we can not be able to do about. We have to understand a forest approach, meaning looking at the whole than just the pieces. We need to operationalize the way we think and see how it actually works. And understand that closed loop thinking is understanding that feedback, when things are done, something else happens. We also develop a quantitative view of how we can measure the performance and finally be able to test how we believe things and make sure that our understanding is actually true. Whenever we practice systems thinking, we have to keep in mind that no matter how much we know of things, we often have this habit of reverting back to what we call traditional thinking. Take note that traditional thinking tends to emphasize things that are static, system more of an effect rather than the cause. We try to understand individual case-by-case situation or a tree-by-tree thinking. We also understand and like to think about factors of influence and correlation rather than understanding real causality. Remember, when we talk about cause and effect, there could be correlation, but correlation is not causation. We also like to have this straight line thinking of cause and effect only. And once we understand the cause, we now solve the effect. We also are so concerned about measuring things that oftentimes we try to measure them for the sake of measuring rather than understanding what the measures mean and what it actually can represent. And finally, focus on providing what we call truth-based thinking, meaning seeking to prove that you're right, oftentimes is the more important thing rather than recognizing that all models are actually wrong. So how do we now practice these systems thinking skills? So for every system thinking skills we have, starting from the dynamic thinking to system as a cause to forest thinking, operational thinking down to a scientific thinking, we are looking at some examples on the right that allows you to demonstrate and have the habit of practicing these skills. For example, dynamic thinking means that you have to now start looking at behaviors of graphs rather than summaries of graphs. Looking at the averages doesn't give you the behavior. System as a cause thinking, instead of blaming others that the system, could not be responsible, we now try to look at how the system is the one influencing and how the system can be better improved so that it becomes more resilient to the shocks. Forest thinking is about understanding the differences and the similarities. Operational thinking is to ask what is the real activities being done, what are the real processes, and rather than simply work with the what if or what should, we have to look at what is. So by looking at these different thinking perspectives, we get to develop now these system thinking skills. Peter Senge shared his views of the laws of systems thinking. These laws will help us guide on the nature of our actions and our thoughts. The 11 laws of systems thinking are as follows. Today's problem oftentimes came from yesterday's solution. We see problems happening now because of the things we did before. The more you try to make things different and you change, the harder it is to change the system. I'm sure you've encountered situations where trying to change the behavior or the culture of the organization is like a futile effort. The behavior gets better before it grows worse. These are times when we think that we found the solution and things gets better immediately but eventually gets bad later on. A solution that gives us an easy way out usually brings us back to the same problem. The fifth one is that the idea we think of might be worse than what we're trying to fix. And I'm sure you can think of decisions made where the cure is actually worse than the disease. The other half of our laws of systems thinking would be faster is slower. The faster you may want to change things, the more it takes time. Trying to do it quick oftentimes brings you back in to the same problem. Addressing the cause and effect is not easy because they're not often related in time and space. It's like the effect only happens after a while. It is not something that happens immediately and therefore harder to fix. Small changes can produce big results, but only if we identify what we call a high leverage area. But oftentimes high leverage areas are least obvious because they're often not seen. You can have your cake and eat it too, but not at once. You cannot have everything together, but you can have them in separate times. Breaking down a problem like an elephant in half does not produce two small elephants. This idea of breaking a problem into pieces often leads us to suboptimal solutions when you put them all back together again. And finally, there is no blame but us who are part of the system. No one function or department is responsible for the entire thing. It's all on us. So what keeps our organization and ourselves from learning and developing this systems perspective? Peter Senge discussed some of these learning disabilities that we need to recognize. In many organizations, you often hear people defending their position, their view. Second, we always look at it in the perspective that it is not us, it's them. Or there is also this illusion of, I'm going to manage it, I'm going to take charge, and actually nothing happens. We often also have a fixation on the events, or we have a complaint, we fix that complaint, so we must be okay when we fix a complaint because it's gone. We also have this perspective of the parable of the boiled frog. When you don't know that you're in a problem area until you're actually deep down or neck deep in it. We also have the delusion of learning from experience because we did this and this did not happen, therefore we are right. And finally, we put so much trust on the management team, but at the end of the day, it is everybody in the organization that has to pull in the work. Some key messages to remember. We are not systems thinkers. We are individuals and have personal beliefs that influence our own mental model of or view of things. We are biased individuals and we constantly need to be mindful that our views can lead us to not understanding or comprehending the system at all. And finally, to develop our systems thinking perspective, we need to develop our habits and skills in order to be able to enhance and grow as systems thinkers.